Imagine for a second that you are planning an expedition to Mount Everest. Except, instead of doing it today, you're doing it in the mid-1990s. The golden age of commercial mountaineering is in full swing. You have a checklist full of things that you need to buy. You need a plane ticket to Kathmandu. You need to hire a logistics company to carry your gear to base camp. You need to hire Sherpas to fix your ropes and carry your oxygen bottles. This was and has been the standard since Everest's early history. It was how everyone climbed the world's highest peak. But in Sweden, a man named Goran Kropp looked at that checklist and threw it in the trash. He decided that if he was going to stand on top of the world, he wasn't going to take any shortcuts. He wasn't going to fly, he wasn't going to use porters, and he certainly wasn't about to breathe compressed gas. So he started packing. He packed his tent, his ropes, his ice axes, and his food. But he didn't pack them into duffel bags destined for a cargo plane. He packed them on a bicycle, specifically a custom-built touring bike towing a single-wheeled trailer. The total weight of his gear was an absurd 240 pounds. On October 16, 1995, he threw his leg over the bike, and he turned his handlebars southeast. His plan was simple, but insane. He was going to pedal 8,000 miles to Kathmandu. Then, he was going to walk to the mountain, carrying all of his own gear, and climb it by himself. And then, he was going to ride his bike all the way back home. It sounds completely insane, and it absolutely is. But this is the story of the hardest commute in human history. To understand why someone would attempt something this ridiculous, let's first look at the man himself. Goran does not look like a high-altitude mountaineer. In a sport dominated by wire-thin, lightweight athletes, Goran was a tank. He stood 6'3" and weighed over 200 pounds. He looked more like a heavyweight boxer or a linebacker than someone built to survive in the thin air of the death zone. The nimble physicality came from his background as a Swedish parachute ranger. He was disciplined, incredibly strong, and possessed a personality that was larger than life. The Americans at base camp would later call him the Crazy Swede. He grew up in an apartment listening to punk rock and reggae. He approached climbing with a rebellious energy that clashed with the conservative, serious nature of the sport. But his motivation for this trip wasn't a joke, it was a protest. By 1995, Everest was becoming a tourist destination. Wealthy clients were paying $65,000 to be guided up the peak. Goran looked at this siege style of climbing and felt it was cheating. He famously argued that Mount Everest isn't 29,000 feet tall if you climb it wearing an oxygen mask. He believed that using Sherpas and artificial air lowered the mountain to your level. He wanted to face the mountain on its own terms. That meant he needed to bring everything himself. The vehicle for this madness was the Crescent Ultima bike. It wasn't a sleek racing bike, it was a mule. It was heavily modified with reinforced racks and custom gearing systems to handle the crushing weight. To carry his climbing equipment, he couldn't just use saddlebags. I mean, he had those too, but he would need a trailer to tow behind him. Into this rig, he packed everything he needed to survive for a year. After all, aside from food, this mission was completely unsupported, meaning everything he would use needed to start out with him already. So he packed his boots, his crampons, his ice axes, and his rope, and he even packed enough food to get him started. Then famously, he joked that he packed only one pair of underwear to save weight. Whether it was one pair or four, the logic was extreme minimalism. And this makes sense, every gram matters when you have to pedal 8,000 miles. The total load was roughly 240 pounds. Most people would struggle to pedal that rig up the driveway, but Goran isn't cut from the same cloth as everybody else. On October 16, 1995, Goran rolled out of Stockholm. On the flat roads of Sweden, he built up momentum, but the hills of Central Europe tested his raw horsepower. Every incline required the output of an elite athlete just to keep the wheels turning. He didn't complain though, he just pedaled harder. The early days were defined by the cold and the absurdity of the situation. He camped in forests and on roadsides, completely self-reliant. In Hungary, his singular focus led to a bizarre situation. Exhausted and looking for a bed, he accidentally checked himself into a brothel. When the madam offered him her daughter for free, Goran awkwardly declined. He didn't have time for distractions, he just wanted to sleep. That night, he had to listen to a knife fight break out in the room next door. And as he crossed into the Middle East, the environment turned hostile. In Turkey and Iran, the roads crumbled beneath his tires. The shoulder often disappeared, forcing him to hold his line in heavy traffic. But the locals would pose bigger threats than the trucks. In some regions, people were antagonized by the sight of a giant Westerner on a bicycle. They threw rocks at him from the side of the road. Cars would drive by and even pelt him with stones. But Goran didn't cower. He rode with a combat mindset, constantly scanning for threats. And when pushed too far, he fought back. Occasionally, he would slam on the brakes, turn the bike around, and stare down his aggressors. The sight of a furious 6'3" giant marching toward them was usually enough to send them running. Then came the chaos of India. The traffic was a river of trucks passing inches from his handlebar. I'm sure you've seen videos online. It was a test of nerves that would have broken most cyclists, but Goran just held his line and kept moving east. By the time he rolled into Kathmandu in April 1996, he had been on the road for 6 months. He had covered 8,000 miles of the hardest terrain on Earth. The journey had tempered him like steel, but it also burned through his reserves. Because he was a vegetarian working so hard on this trip, he couldn't eat enough to replace what he burned. He had sacrificed 24 pounds of muscle to the road. He arrived in Nepal weathered and skinny. He had completed the commute, but now he had to rebuild his strength, because the actual work was only just getting started. For pretty much every single Everest climber, the journey to base camp begins with a flight. They board a plane to the airstrip of Lukla to save precious time for the mountain. Oddly enough, Goran had sworn off motors, so he rode his bike to the end of the pavement in a village called Jiri. He stored his bike and trailer and transformed from a cyclist into a porter. He had 143 pounds of climbing gear, food, and supplies that needed to get up the mountain. It was too much weight to carry in a single push over the steep Himalayan trails. He adopted a punishing strategy known as shuttling. He would load up a heavy pack, hike a few miles up the trail, and stash the gear. Then he would turn around, walk back down the mountain empty-handed. He would pick up the rest of his gear and hike it back up to the cache. This meant that for every mile on the trail, Goran walked it 3 times. 2 times up, 1 time down. It turned a standard 1-week hike into nearly 2 weeks of brutal manual labor. This was so strikingly different than the typical expedition. When he finally hauled his gear into Everest Base Camp in April, the contrast became even sharper. The 1996 season was the peak of commercial excess. The big expedition teams had set up tent cities. One tent even had an espresso machine. Goran set up his small tent on the glacier, a tiny island of self-sufficiency. While the clients of other expeditions rested and acclimated, Goran cooked his own meals on a small stove. The American teams would watch him with a mix of confusion and respect. They dubbed him the Crazy Swede. But he wasn't crazy, he was hardening himself. He had just spent 6 months riding a bike and 2 weeks hauling heavy loads. He was exhausted, but he was also acclimated to suffering. And the capacity for suffering was about to be the only thing that mattered. Because the mountain didn't care about his bike ride. He now had to climb 29,000 feet and head into the death zone by himself. By early May, Goran was ready to make his move. But on Everest, ready is a relative term. Every climber on the mountain spends weeks going up and down to acclimate. It's the standard process to build enough red blood cells to survive. But for the commercial clients, these are essentially training runs. They'll carry a light pack with some water and obviously wearing their jacket. Their Sherpas will do the heavy lifting, stocking the high camps with tents, fuel, and oxygen bottles. But Goran had to be his own Sherpa. When he climbed to the high camps, he wasn't just hiking it. He was hauling 60 pounds of survival gear on his back. He carried his tent, his stove, and his fuel up to Camp 1, then Camp 2, then Camp 3. By the time he launched his summit push on May 3rd, he had already expanded a massive amount of energy just positioning himself at his camp. He started his final climb from Camp 4 at 26,200 feet. He was entirely alone. The conditions were brutal. There was no beaten path to follow. He was breaking trail in deep snow without supplemental oxygen. Every step required a massive effort of will. He would take a step, collapse over his ice axe, and breathe for a minute just to gather the strength for the next step. But he just kept moving. By early afternoon, he reached the south summit. He was at 28,740 feet. The true summit was right there. It was a small snow dome just 350 feet away. He could see it. He could practically touch it even. It would take him maybe an hour to get there. But as he looked at his watch, he realized it was 2 p.m. He had a strict turnaround time for himself. He knew that if he continued, he would reach the top, but he would have to descend in the dark. He did a cold, hard calculation. He knew he had the strength to get up, but he didn't have the energy to get down safely. Most climbers in that position would have pushed on. They would have let summit fever take over, justifying the risk because they had come so far. Goran had more sunk costs than anyone. He had cycled 8,000 miles for this moment. He had suffered through 6 months of hell for this specific hour. But he didn't hesitate. He turned his back on the summit and started walking down. Later, when asked why, his answer was simple. Quote, "I was too tired." That decision was the ultimate display of discipline. Just 1 week later, on May 10th, other climbers would stand in that exact same spot. They would ignore their turnaround times. They would push for the summit late in the day. And 8 of them would die in the storm that followed. Goran survived because he understood something they didn't. The summit is optional, but getting down is mandatory. So he dragged himself back to base camp. He was alive, but he was depleted. While he rested, the mountain fell apart. The infamous storm of May 10th, 1996 struck. While commercial teams were fighting for their lives high above, Goran was helping carry medicine and supplies to the rescue effort below. The tragedy reinforced everything he believed about the danger of the mountain. But he wasn't done yet. He spent 3 weeks recovering. His diet was pure desperation. He sat in his tent and devoured a whole can of butter, trying to force calories back into his body. And on May 23rd, he went back up. This time, the weather held. He climbed through the night, passing the bodies of those who had died weeks earlier. At 1 p.m., Goran Kropp stepped onto the summit of Mount Everest. He had no Sherpas and no oxygen mask. He had cycled 8,000 miles to stand where he is right now. But there was no celebration. He later said he didn't even feel like a conqueror. He felt like a survivor. He snapped a few photos and immediately turned around. He knew the climb wasn't over until he was off the mountain. He descended safely back to base camp. Most people would have called a helicopter or even just booked a flight. But Goran packed his camp into a backpack. He hiked his load back down the trail to Jiri. There, he retrieved his bicycle and trailer from storage. He loaded everything up and started pedaling west. He had a long commute home. For the return journey, his girlfriend Renata joined him on her own bike. Having company didn't make the miles any shorter though. They still had to pedal across the vastness of Russia and Europe. It was another punishing 8,000 miles of saddle sores and headwinds. When he finally rolled into Stockholm in late 1996, he stood alone in history. He had covered nearly 16,000 miles under his own power. He had climbed the highest peak on Earth without a single breath of bottled oxygen. He had stripped away every safety net and every excuse. He was the ultimate autonomous climber, a man who looked at the hardest physical challenge on the planet and decided it wasn't hard enough.